Hey guys, tonight we plunge into the candle-flickered corridors of power, where the thrones are cold, the kings are colder, and you're probably not making it out of this bedtime journey unscarred. Not by bloodshed, don't worry. We're keeping it PG-13, but by the sheer aching awkwardness of the worst monarchs medieval Europe ever coughed up. You're standing barefoot on chilled stone, the air heavy with incense and mildew. The flicker of torchlight dances against moldy tapestries. You shuffle forward in a place where no sane person sleeps well, especially not when the man ruling the realm is Charles VI of France. Or, as his therapist, if therapist had been a thing, might have called him, a complex case. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and the time, let me know what hour of the night history has caught you in. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in Paris. It's 1392 and the King of France is preparing for war. Well, he thinks he is. One moment he's giving orders, pacing in circles with his boots squeaking on the palace floor, and the next he's frozen mid-step, eyes wide, arms shaking like a haunted windmill. Charles VI, not yet 30, believes someone is trying to kill him. And not just someone, everyone. His doctors have applied leeches, his advisors have burned herbs, and his wife has tried bless her to convince him that the furniture is not, in fact, whispering secrets behind his back. Charles wasn't always like this. In the early years, they called him Charles the Beloved, but something snapped. Possibly a genetic gift from the Habsburg family tree. Possibly the medieval diet of questionable cheese and mercury-laced remedies. Historians still argue whether his mental decline was triggered by lead poisoning, schizophrenia, or just the sheer weight of being a king in an age where bathing was optional, but inbreeding wasn't. And then came the infamous forest incident. You trudge behind Charles on a hunting trip meant to lift his spirits. The sun blazes. His men clink in chainmail. A squire drops a lance. Clang! The king wheels around like someone fired a gun which didn't exist yet and shouts, treason. He draws his sword and starts slashing indiscriminately. He kills 4 of his own men before collapsing, foaming at the mouth, whispering, they were imposters. You probably won't survive this. When he wakes days later, Charles remembers nothing. But now it's clear the king has unraveled like an old pair of royal socks. In a bizarre episode, he refuses to bathe or change his clothes for 5 months. Instead, he sits on his throne and stares at the stained glass windows like they're giving him instructions. Occasionally, he laughs at jokes no one hears. One fringe story historian still debate its credibility says that during particularly bad spells, Charles insisted he was made of glass, not metaphorically, literally. He feared shattering, and so demanded iron rods sewn into his royal robes to keep him intact. Walking became difficult. Sitting was a logistical puzzle. Hugs off the table. And his court, oh, they played along. Imagine being a courtier and needing to reassure your monarch. No, sire. You are definitely not about to break. That is simply your strength. Shimmering. Sometimes he ran through the palace halls, screaming about invisible enemies. Other times he failed to recognize his own wife and children. At one point, he believed he was Saint George reincarnated, here to slay dragons that, inconveniently, only he could see. Meanwhile, France disintegrated. The Hundred Years' War wasn't going great, and with a king who thought mirrors were portals and carpets were traps. The nobility basically said, let's rule this mess ourselves. That led to factions, betrayals, and civil war. And yet, Charles looked regal. That was the tragic irony. His long face, curly hair, and sad royal eyes made him seem noble in tapestries. Just don't try to hold a conversation with him. He might ask if you're also made of porcelain. His wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, essentially became regent in all but name. She steered the ship while Charles drifted in and out of delusion, sometimes wearing a crown, sometimes a nightgown, sometimes both. Some nobles accused her of sleeping with Charles's brother. Others claimed she ran a shadow government. Either way, someone had to sign documents while the king was whispering to walls. And then came the Bal des Ardents, or what we like to call the night the king almost became charcoal. You sneak into the ballroom, masked dancers twirl under chandeliers. Perfume hangs in the air. The king arrives dressed as a wild man for a masquerade. His costume is made of flax and pitch. Yes, the flammable stuff. Someone brings in a torch. Within seconds, Charles and his companions are aflame. The crowd screams. Courtiers fling wine, not realizing alcohol only makes fire worse. Charles survives by diving into a barrel of water. His dance partners are not so lucky. The incident scars him further mentally and physically. For the rest of his reign, Charles is only sporadically lucid. He signs treaties one day, calls for ghost exorcisms the next. At one point, he's found trying to hold a diplomatic conversation with the tapestry. And yet, his reign lasts 42 years, mostly because no one dared replace him, not until he died in 1422, possibly believing he was still a glass man. So here you are, tiptoeing back down the palace corridor, past empty suits of armor and a golden harp that hasn't been played in years. You hear the king humming in his chambers, or maybe crying. It's hard to tell. One terrible king down. 19 to go. You shuffle from fog-draped Paris to the harsher winds of the Balkans, where the mountains stab the sky and even the birds seem too scared to sing. It's the 14th century in Bulgaria, and you're standing just behind the royal tent of a man who makes Charles the Mad look like a mild-mannered librarian. This is Ivan IV of Bulgaria, or, as he liked to be called, Tsar Ivan the Terrible. And no, not that Ivan the Terrible. Russia's gloom-fueled nightmare is still a couple of centuries away. This is the original Balkan flavor. Fewer beards, more backstabbing. Ivan IV, also known as Ivan Sratsimir, rules with the subtlety of a rock slide. His court is more like a daycare full of venomous toddlers, except they all wear crowns and carry swords. And Ivan well. Ivan likes two things: power and control over personal grooming. You learn quickly that Ivan has opinions about appearances. Specifically, beards. Long, short, twisted. Curled, each style reflects not just taste but loyalty. One noble dares trim his beard into a foreign-inspired point. Ivan calls it traitorous chin art and has the poor guy executed. No warning. Just a very public, very messy end. Historians still argue whether Ivan's beard laws were symbolic of a deeper insecurity or just the power trip of a man who needed more hobbies. It gets weirder. Ivan is known to hold royal councils where he paces barefoot over cold tile floors for hours. No one speaks unless spoken to. Not because of court etiquette, but because once, A duke coughed while Ivan was mid-sentence and ended up exiled to a swamp? The next guy who sneezed was allegedly made to clean chamber pots for monks in a remote monastery. For clarity of lungs, Ivan reportedly said, "And then there's the infamous crown incident. It's early morning. You're in the royal chapel. Ivan is about to anoint himself again because once a year apparently isn't enough. The gold crown, bejeweled and wildly oversized, is lifted onto his head by trembling priests. But Ivan doesn't like the angle. He yanks it himself, pulls too hard, and cracks the gemstone centerpiece straight down the middle. He freezes. Everyone else freezes. A lesser king would shrug. Ivan launches into a full tantrum, screaming, shouting. The kind of meltdown you'd expect from a child who dropped his ice cream. He accuses the bishop of sabotage. The crownsmith is whipped. The chapel is cleansed of demons with smoke, which triggers a 3-day asthma attack in half the court. You're starting to think royal ceremonies need fewer accessories. And speaking of smoke and demons, there's an odd footnote in Ivan's rule involving an abandoned monastery and a mysterious wine barrel. According to a fringe account, Ivan once ordered wine to be fermented in the tomb of a saint. He believed it would give the vintage divine properties. The monks protested. Ivan responded by drinking an entire goblet in front of them, declaring, "It tastes like holiness," and then promptly fainted. Some say it was tainted wine. Others whisper that he had visions of fire, angels, and a very angry pigeon. You'll never know. He banned discussion of the incident and executed the one monk who tried to paint it into a fresco. His paranoia eventually turns to family. Ivan suspects his cousin, also named Ivan, because this is medieval naming conventions at their finest, is plotting against him. He invites cousin Ivan to dinner. A grand feast. Musicians. Jesters. Roast swan. Then, just as dessert is served pear tart with cinnamon, Ivan accuses his cousin of treason and has him strangled with a gold-threaded table runner. Still chewing. The court is speechless. Ivan just smiles and says, "Too rich for his taste. You try not to blink too loudly after that." Now here's the kicker. Ivan wasn't entirely without administrative skill. He did try to reform tax collection. One, he set up a system where collectors dressed as monks would wander the villages and extract offerings from peasants in the name of the Tsar and Saint Elijah. Naturally, this went about as well as you'd expect. The peasants rebelled. The tax collectors ran off with the silver. One scholarly theory suggests Ivan didn't mind. He got to claim moral superiority and pretend he was betrayed his two favorite things. And then, the Turks come knocking. The Ottoman Empire is expanding, and Ivan is woefully unprepared. Not militarily, he has weapons. But diplomatically, he's a human firework. Instead of building alliances, Ivan accuses neighboring rulers of cowardice, sorcery, and once being descended from cheese. It's unclear if this was an insult or just poor translation. The Ottomans eventually capture him. And here's where accounts split. Some say Ivan is imprisoned and lives out his final days in a Turkish fortress, sipping bitter tea and muttering to portraits. Others claim he escaped dressed as a woman and lived anonymously in a convent. And a few wild tales insist he returned to Bulgaria, disguised as a traveling lute player who performed royal ballads about himself. Historians still debate whether this is complete fantasy or just one of those truths too weird to disprove. What we do know is that by the end, Bulgaria is fractured. Ivan is dethroned. and the only crown that fits is a metaphorical one of stubbornness, vanity, and bizarre executions. So now, as you step out of the shadow of Yvonne's ruined palace, you glance at your own reflection in a puddle. Better not change your hairstyle tonight. You never know which century you'll wake up in. You leave behind the soot-smudged monasteries of Bulgaria and float gently into the misty gray mornings of England, where the kings have very proper accents, very shiny crowns, and, occasionally, the cognitive consistency of a bowl of porridge. Enter Henry VI of England. He's not violent. He doesn't melt down over beard styles. But oh boy, Henry brings a unique flavor to the terrible king buffet, the kind that simply doesn't show up for the job. Like, ever? You find yourself at court, tucked between two yawning scribes and a guard who's using his halberd as a leaning post. Everyone is waiting for the king. You've been waiting for hours. A mouse runs across the dais, still no king. Eventually, someone whispers, "He's praying." Fair enough. Except it turns out Henry's been in his chapel for 3 days straight, quoting scripture and composing his 90-second Latin poem to Jesus. And there are actual wars going on. Henry VI inherited the throne as a baby after his famous warrior father. Henry V died young, probably from overachieving. People hoped young Henry would grow into greatness. He did not. By his teens, he had a fondness for monastic retreats, doves, and books about saints being gently martyred. While other monarchs learned to joust or yell at vassals, Henry learned how to look deeply into the middle distance and whisper, "Let there be peace," which would have been fine if England weren't in the middle of the 100 Years' War. The French were not interested in Henry's pacifism. They were interested in land, power, and occasionally setting English supply lines on fire. But Henry preferred to avoid confrontation. Once, when asked for a military decision, he responded, "Let God's will be done." Then he left the room to feed birds. Historians still argue whether Henry suffered from severe depression, catatonia, or a rare dissociative disorder that caused him to emotionally vanish like a particularly pious cloud. But one moment stands out: the great catatonic year. It's 1453. England has lost almost all of its holdings in France. Henry receives the news and simply breaks. Like a royal power switch has been flipped off. He stops speaking. He stops eating properly. He doesn't recognize his own newborn son. His wife, Margaret of Anjou, holds the baby up to him. Henry stares blankly ahead like someone reading an especially difficult IKEA manual. The court panics. A protectorate is set up under Richard, Duke of York, and tensions simmer. You know what's coming, the Wars of the Roses. It's not all doom and gloom. Though one charmingly weird detail: Henry is obsessed with creating a network of colleges and chapels. While the nobles sharpened swords, Henry founds Eton and King's College, Cambridge. "Let us build for the soul," he says. While the kingdom disintegrates into a civil war so messy it makes your high school group projects look harmonious. Also, Henry writes poetry. A lot of poetry. Mostly sad, mostly in Latin. And he makes his courtiers read it. You imagine a grizzled knight being summoned to court, expecting battle orders, only to be handed a parchment of rhyming stanzas about lilies, lambs, and the sorrows of the meek. Apparently, some knights cried from confusion, most likely. And then there's Margaret. Queen Margaret is not here to play harp music and sip rosewater. She's French. She's pragmatic. And she has had enough. As Henry retreats into his sad poetry and Gregorian chant playlists, She takes the reins. She raises armies. She negotiates alliances. She personally leads troops into battle. Meanwhile, Henry is still wandering the gardens talking to bees. Figuratively, hopefully. One fringe account claims he once asked a bishop whether birds had souls and requested a formal royal debate on the issue. The debate was scheduled. No one showed up, not even the birds. Eventually, Henry is captured by the rival Yorkist faction. He spends time imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he mostly prays and stares at the ceiling. Historians still debate whether he ever understood why he was imprisoned, or if he even noticed. But just when you think it's over, he's briefly restored to the throne in what's known as the readeption of Henry VI. Sounds triumphant, right? Except it lasted barely a year and Henry spends most of it. Yep, you guessed it. Praying, writing poems, and quietly falling apart. It all ends with his death, possibly murdered on the orders of Edward IV, or perhaps from sheer spiritual exhaustion. Even in death, Henry VI is more enigma than monarch. You leave him where he liked to be most in the cloister, muttering to saints while the kingdom bled, and as you tiptoe out of the crumbling abbey, past ivy-choked windows and tired monks sweeping the floor, you can't help but think at least Ivan the Terrible remembered to show up to work. You wander away from England's damp moors, past monasteries echoing with melancholy psalms, and drift into the cloud-capped Alps where the valleys are quiet. The lakes shimmer like enchanted mirrors, and castles sit like iced cakes on mountaintops. It's Bavaria, 19th century. Wait, 19th century? Yep. Our next monarch might not technically fall inside the medieval bracket, but Ludwig II of Bavaria deserves a spot at this terrible king's sleepover because he ruled like a medieval fantasy character someone forgot to proofread. You find yourself beside a glittering lake. Mist curls over the water. In the distance, a castle rises, spires, turrets, balconies fit for opera. You blink. Is this real, or are you in a dream designed by a Disney architect? No, it's real. And it's Ludwig's. This is Neuschwanstein Castle, one of the most famous fairy tale structures in the world. And Ludwig built it not to live in, but to imagine living in it. You can't make this up. Ludwig was crowned king in 1864, young, shy, and extremely romantic. Not romantic like candlelit dinners, romantic like builds mountain fortresses because the moon told him to. Instead of governing, Ludwig locked himself in his chambers and read medieval sagas by candlelight. He adored the operas of Richard Wagner so much that he personally funded Wagner's increasingly bizarre performances. Historians still argue whether this was patronage or just a king-shaped sugar daddy situation. You shuffle into one of his castles because he didn't stop at one and find rooms modeled after legends of Parsifal, with walls covered in murals of knights fighting dragons, and chandeliers shaped like crowns of thorns. There's a room designed to simulate a grotto, complete with artificial lighting and a waterfall. He would sit there in a silk robe, humming arias to himself. Now here's the kicker: Ludwig loved solitude, like aggressively. He hated speaking to ministers, never led wars, and held court alone, with empty chairs so he could pretend to hold conversations with invisible nobles. One evening, he insists his entire dinner staff wear medieval garb and serve a banquet to no one. He eats alone in a room filled with mannequins dressed as guests. You sit in the shadows, watching as he toasts a lifeless crowd, eyes sparkling with something that's not quite sanity. one of Ludwig's quirks. He was obsessed with the moon. He rode through forest in an elaborate golden sleigh by night, dressed like a 13th century crusader, stopping occasionally to shout poetry at the stars. Some said he conversed with swans and claimed they were reincarnated knights. There's an unconfirmed rumor he once tried to marry one. Well, more of a symbolic ceremony, but still. He also commissioned flying machines before airplanes were a thing. Inventors came with drawings. Ludwig nodded solemnly and paid them handsomely. None of them ever got off the ground, except, metaphorically, when they disappeared with their king-funded fortunes. You'd think the ministers would intervene sooner. But Ludwig was popular with the people. He was eccentric. Yes, but he wasn't cruel. He gave lavish gifts, spared no expense in the arts, and once pardoned a thief because the moon might have whispered poor advice that night. Eventually, however, the state coffers run dry. Bavaria's economy stumbles. Ministers beg him to stop building castles. He ignores them and drafts plans for a floating palace instead. Seriously, the government stages an intervention. In 1886, a group of doctors, without examining him directly, declares Ludwig clinically insane, the 19th century equivalent of a power move. He is deposed, but it gets darker. He's placed under supervision at Lake Starnberg. One evening, Ludwig goes for a walk with his psychiatrist. Hours pass, the two are found dead in the lake. No wounds, no struggle, just a floating king and his doctor. Historians still debate what happened. Was it suicide murder? A desperate attempt at escape? Some even whisper that Ludwig faked his death and built one final castle deep in the mountains. All we know for sure is this Ludwig ruled like a medieval dreamer in an age of steam engines and constitutional monarchies. And while his legacy is plastered on tourist mugs and posters, his actual reign was a bizarre, sad detour into fantasy at the expense of reality. You slip quietly down a marble staircase. The echoes of Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries fade behind you. Outside, the moon watches silently, and somewhere, a golden sleigh waits for a king who never wanted to rule, only to escape. You leave the chilly Bavarian slopes behind and step into warmer, dustier air. Spain, 14th century. The light is golden, the olive trees shimmer, and the wine flows like diplomacy should. But don't get too cozy, because here comes Charles II of Navarre, also known lovingly, sarcastically as Charles the Bad. That's not a nickname handed out lightly. The Bad is the kind of title you earn with years of dedicated scheming, questionable morals, and a solid record of royal tantrums. And Charles O, he delivers. You arrive in Pamplona to find smoke curling above the rooftops. Someone, Charles, let's be honest, has just torched part of his own capital city. Why depends on who you ask. The rebels say it was to punish dissent. The loyalists say it was an accidental purging. A local cheesemonger claims it started over a spoiled shipment of manchego. Historians still argue whether the fire was deliberate strategy or just another royal overreaction to bad dairy logistics. Either way, Charles watches it burn with calm satisfaction, swirling wine in a goblet shaped like a lion's head. He mutters something about cleansing the soul of the city, then turns to you and asks, "Do you hear them screaming? Or singing, Singing. Definitely singing. Charles's career begins like a soap opera. He inherits the throne of Navarre, a small but spicy kingdom wedged between France and Spain. And from the start, he's more interested in plotting than governing. He spends so much time bouncing between courts in France and England that people joke he rules by carrier pigeon. The big issue, he thinks he deserves more land, a lot more, like the Duchy of Burgundy, or maybe Champagne, or the whole of Normandy. And he's willing to backstab anyone family, allies, his own shadow to get it. One famous episode involves poison. Charles invites his father-in-law, a powerful noble, to dinner. The meal is lavish. The wine is heavy. The soup? Possibly. A little experimental. The guest falls ill. Very ill. Dies soon after. Everyone suspects Charles. No one proves anything. Charles smiles just a little too long at the funeral, but poisoning wasn't his only move. Charles kept a shadow army, not just mercenaries, but mercenaries who hated each other, just to keep them in check. He pitted them against one another like reality TV contestants. One unit guarded the treasury, another the food stores, and you tiptoe past both and try not to breathe too loud. Here's a lesser-known but juicy fringe tale. Charles was obsessed with astrology. He hired a mystic who swore the stars had a plan for Navarre's expansion. Unfortunately, the plan required several ceremonial purges. At one point, Charles ordered all the town bells melted down because their ringing was causing unfavorable planetary interference. The bells were melted, the economy wobbled. The mystic vanished, possibly into a dungeon, possibly into thin air. As for the stars, they remained entirely unimpressed. And then came the really dark turn, Charles's final illness. You're in his chamber now. Heavy curtains, velvet hangings, a dozen anxious servants. Charles has fallen seriously ill. He lies motionless, swaddled in linens soaked in brandy, because medieval medicine thought that was a good idea. But now there's a problem how to seal the bandages. A servant suggests stitching. Another proposes wax. A third, unfortunately for everyone, says, let's use heat. And so they light a candle. A spark catches. The brandy-soaked linens ignite. Instantly. Charles, King of Navarre, the bat himself, is engulfed in flames. He dies not from plague, or war, or treason, but from an accidental brandy fire, caused by his own treatment regimen. You back away from the scorched chamber, the smell of smoke and regret lingering in your clothes. It's like the universe looked at Charles's lifetime of calculated cruelty and said, let's end this with irony, even in death. Charles left chaos. His will was vague, his debts were enormous, and the nobles he'd manipulated for decades began eating each other alive the moment he was gone. One tried to declare himself king. Another tried to claim Charles's horse. The horse bit him. It was all very on brand. As you wander past the burnt-out remains of the palace wing, a page boy sweeps ashes into a pile and hums. The bat is dead, he says softly, almost like a lullaby. And no one's crying. Maybe someone is, but they're probably just mourning the manchego. From the burnt drapery and brandy-scented ruins of Navarre, you're carried northward by a chill breeze over the slate rooftops of Copenhagen. The year is 1770. You hover just above the flickering oil lamps of the Danish court, where violins whisper in candlelit parlors, and behind every mirror lies a scandal. This is the kingdom of Christian VII of Denmark, a monarch so unfit to rule that the court operates more like an elaborate daycare than a seat of power. Christian becomes king as a teenager, and everyone quickly realizes he's not well. Not just eccentric deeply, visibly unstable. His eyes flicker between paranoia and ecstasy. He speaks in sudden bursts, recites entire plays to himself, and once interrupts a royal council meeting by leaping onto a table and performing a wordless interpretive dance. No one claps. You join his advisors in the grand hall. Tapestries hang stiff with cold, and the throne sits a little too empty even when occupied. The king lounges sideways on it, one leg over the armrest, plucking imaginary strings in the air. I am a violin, he murmurs, but they forgot the bow. And fair enough. Historians still argue about the diagnosis. Schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, autism. Some say it was just a case of extreme trauma from a childhood starved of affection. Others claim it was lead poisoning from royal cosmetics. Whatever the root, Christian is not steering the ship, but he is fascinated by two things: masturbation and pranks. No, seriously. Christian is known for making loud, crude jokes in public and for chronic, obsessive self-pleasuring. Court doctors, deeply alarmed, write reports about how this excessive indulgence is weakening his constitution. They try recommending cold baths and horseback riding. Christian responds by playing hide-and-seek with the palace guards, alone, for hours. And yet, in this tangle of dysfunction, a strange triangle begins to form. Enter Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's physician, calm, sharp, and glowing with Enlightenment ideals. Struensee quickly becomes Christian's favorite person. He listens, he soothes, he helps the king bathe and dress. Soon, he's whispering advice during council meetings and signing decrees for the king. Behind the scenes, he's basically ruling Denmark, and not entirely badly at first. Struensee modernizes the kingdom, abolishes torture, promotes education, introduces press freedom. But he also falls very deeply in love with Queen Caroline Matilda, Christian's neglected young English wife. So now you've got a royal love affair, a mad king, and a physician pulling puppet strings. It's a Scandinavian soap opera with powdered wigs. One fringe account claims that Christian once walked in on Struensee and the queen mid-tryst, paused, clapped politely, and said, "Lovely." No one knows if he understood the situation or just liked the embroidery on the bedspread. You walk with the queen through frost-dusted gardens, where she reads letters from Struensee tucked inside Latin poetry. Meanwhile, Christian is riding a tricycle up and down the palace halls, wearing a paper crown and reciting Hamlet backwards. You can't tell if anyone's running the country or if it's all just running on inertia. Eventually, the court gets suspicious. Not of the king, everyone's long since given up on that, but of how much power Struensee has. The nobles seethe. The queen's flirtations aren't exactly subtle, and rumors of illegitimacy swirl around her infant daughter. A coup brews. The queen's own mother-in-law, Juliana Maria, begins plotting. It's quiet at first, whispers, glances, reshuffled dinner placements, but the gears of betrayal start turning. One cold January night, soldiers storm the palace. Struensee is dragged from bed in his nightshirt. The queen is arrested, barefoot and crying. Christian, he's found hiding under a table, giggling. Struensee is imprisoned, tortured, and eventually beheaded, his body drawn and quartered. A gruesome fate for a man who just wanted to end judicial beatings and write love letters. Caroline Matilda is exiled to a lonely estate in northern Germany. She never sees her children again. And Christian, he's allowed to remain king in name. But from this moment on, he is carefully managed, medicated, and muffled. He wanders the palace talking to dogs, playing with clocks, and drawing circles on the wall with chalk. You watch him through a frost-blurred window as he turns, smiles vaguely, and declares, "Today, I am invisible." Then he walks out of the room backwards. He lives like this for decades. Not quite mad enough to remove. Not quite sane enough to matter. A ghost king in velvet slippers. And so you step away from Christian VII, whose reign is remembered not for the wars he won or laws he passed, but for the way he danced without music. While Denmark slipped quietly into other people's hands, you step carefully out of Copenhagen's Hall of Mirrors and into the low, damp mists of medieval England again. The Thames slinks past reed-choked banks, and somewhere in the distance, monks are muttering Latin prayers for royal sanity. Good luck with that. Because this time, you're dealing with King John of England, a man so legendarily awful, so chronically disliked, that centuries later he's still getting bad press in Robin Hood movies. And trust me, the real John makes the movie versions look like misunderstandings. Spoiler, they weren't. You walk through the halls of Westminster and everything's just a little off. The servants are tense. The nobles flinch when summoned. The treasury smells faintly of desperation. You look around and think, yep, he's here. John wasn't supposed to be king. He was the youngest son of Henry II, never meant to rule, which is maybe why his nickname as a child was John Lackland. Cute, right? Not if you're John. Being called the landless one when your siblings are busy becoming kings and queens and lion-hearted crusaders. Not a great start. Still, fate hands him the crown in 1199 after his brother. Richard the Lionheart dies from an infected arrow wound. The kingdom sighs and prepares for mild disappointment. Instead, it gets a catastrophe in a tunic. You first meet John sitting in a tent somewhere in Normandy, arguing with his own generals. Loudly, over cheese rations. By the end of the meeting, 2 barons have left his service. One threatens to switch sides, and the cheese still hasn't arrived. John proceeds to lose Normandy, a crown jewel of English continental holdings, through a mix of rash decisions, broken alliances, and possibly a personal vendetta against success. He doesn't take it well. In retaliation, he starts taxing the English nobility like it's an Olympic event. He invents fees, forest fines, widow taxes, a charge for crossing bridges. A rumor spreads that he even tried taxing rainwater. Historians still debate whether that one's apocryphal, but honestly, with John feels possible. But the most infamous moment in his train wreck of a reign is the Magna Carta. You're there. The year is 1215. The barons are furious. The country is boiling. They corner John at Runnymede and demand he sign a document limiting royal power. John agrees, sort of. He signs it, yes, grumbling the whole time. Probably grinding his teeth into dust, but the ink's barely dry before he starts writing letters to the Pope, asking for an annulment. The Pope obliges. The Magna Carta is declared null and void. The barons explode. Civil war erupts. John flees. He manages to lose London, his dignity, and, in a baffling twist, the royal crown jewels in a swamp. Yes, that happened. You're now following the king across the marshes of the Wash. It's October. The mud sucks at your boots. The rain is biblical. John's treasure caravan gets caught by the tide. Chests full of gold, silver plate, even the crown itself swallowed by the sea like some sort of cosmic joke. A monk writes that this is a sign from God. John curses, possibly at the ocean, possibly at the sky. He falls ill not long after. Now, here comes the fringe story. Some say John died of dysentery, brought on by stress and bad shellfish. Others, less polite ones, suggest he was poisoned by his own cook. And still others claim he overdosed on peaches and cider during a dramatic binge brought on by self-pity and heartburn. Historians still argue the cause of death, but the ending is the same. John dies, bloated and sweating, in the middle of a storm. Most of the country does not mourn. One chronicler even writes, "Hell itself is fouled by his presence." Ouch. But the true tragedy, John wasn't entirely without intelligence. He was literate, clever, and cunning, just in all the wrong directions. Instead of building loyalty, he hoarded power. Instead of listening, he manipulated. And instead of ruling wisely, he treated England like a personal coin purse with peasants attached. And so, as you tiptoe away from his swamp-stained legacy, you pass a monk carving his epitaph into stone. He pauses, frowns, and erases the word regret, then shrugs and writes good riddance. You can almost hear John shouting from beyond, "I had plans." But it's too late. The tide came for the crown, and the king followed soon after. You cross the channel again, pulled toward a court where the air smells of roast venison, sweat-soaked chainmail, and, let's be honest, a whiff of something fried. Welcome to France. Specifically, the early 1100s. And sitting on a reinforced chair with a strained cushion is Louis XVI, better known as Louis the Fat. That's not a playground insult. That's the official historian-approved nickname. You find him in a tent that creaks ominously every time he shifts. He's armored up, sort of. The chainmail doesn't quite fit over his belly anymore, so his aides are helping him into what looks like a hybrid between knight's gear and a very ambitious picnic blanket. A general politely pretends not to notice. A squire is sweating bullets trying to buckle the king's bootstraps. Somewhere, a horse is praying to be reassigned. Louis wasn't always enormous. In his youth, he actually fought battles and led raids with gusto. But years of royal feasting, rich sauces, and a life largely spent in saddles and throne rooms gradually turned him into what a courtier once described as an orb with arms. And yet he kept riding into battle. That's the problem. Imagine a siege. The banners are raised, trumpets blare. Louis mounts his warhorse, which groans audibly, then immediately falls off before they even leave camp. Not once. Repeatedly. You witness this unfortunate routine. The nobles try to help, but the king refuses a mounting block. A king climbs alone, he declares, then slips sideways and crushes a flower cart. The peasants just quietly reload the fruit baskets. In one particularly humiliating incident, Louis leads an army against rebellious barons. Mid-charge, he shouts his rallying cry, "To glory," and immediately rides into a ditch. Not a dramatic, cinematic trench, just a humble, muddy dip in the field. The charge halts. Knights help him out while trying not to laugh. One horse runs away entirely. But don't mistake him for completely useless. Louis had a sharp mind, especially when it came to politics. He loved clashing with overmighty nobles and was instrumental in bringing the rebellious vassals of France back under some semblance of control. Unfortunately, he did this while wheezing, belching, and frequently getting stuck in doorways. One mainstream fact, he was one of the first Capetian kings to aggressively centralize royal power. Before Louis, the French crown was more like a distant suggestion. After him, the monarchy had teeth, albeit clogged with gravy. Still, even his victories came with problems. After beating one count into submission, Louis celebrates with a 7-course banquet. He eats so much roast duck and almond pudding that he passes out mid-toast. His advisors fan him with parchment. The nobles quietly keep eating. The jester juggles nervously in the corner. A fringe tale from the monk Suger Louis' loyal biographer and spin doctor mentions that the king once led troops barefoot to inspire humility. What Suger fails to mention is that Louis's bootlaces had snapped. The king was just annoyed and decided, forget it. We march. The humility was entirely accidental. And then there's the business with the monk's wine cellar. Louis, always on the hunt for moral improvement, decides to visit an abbey. While there, he accidentally gets locked inside the wine cellar overnight. The monks find him in the morning, curled up beside 3 empty casks and a sermon he started writing called On Moderation. He never finishes it, but his greatest embarrassment may be how he died, not from a glorious final battle or divine vision, but from a combination of obesity and poor digestion. Toward the end, he couldn't ride, couldn't walk, and required multiple aids just to sit upright during court proceedings. He spent his last days sweating through robes, giving orders between naps, and requesting constant foot massages from monks who clearly drew the short straw. His son, Louis VII, watched all of this with wide eyes and eventually said, "Maybe I'll eat slightly less boar." So as you shuffle out of Louis's royal tent, careful not to trip on a leftover ham bone, you realize something odd for all his failures. Louis VI wasn't hated. He was frustrating, slow, undignified, and mildly flammable, but people liked him. He tried. He cared. He reined in chaos, even if he occasionally rolled into it first. Still, you can't help but remember the ditch, and the sound of armor echoing off fruit carts, and the way his advisors said, "Your Highness," with just a hint of a sigh. You drift north again, brushing past low-hanging clouds and the spires of Durham Cathedral, until you reach the harsh borderlands of medieval Scotland. The wind here doesn't whisper, it slaps, and the hills roll like green fists into England's ribs. This is the stomping ground of William the Lion, King of Scots, who ruled from 1165 to 1214, and somehow managed to invade England so many times and fail every single one. You find him pacing before a war council, red-haired, scowling, muttering things about honor and English insolence. His sword rattles with every step, not from valor but from frustration. Because once again, he's gathered troops, donned his best battle cloak, and prepared to cross the border into a complete strategic disaster. William earned his lion-hearted nickname not from courage but from marketing. His royal seal featured a proud lion, bold, fierce, majestic. The real William less lion, more very determined terrier. Let's rewind. After becoming king, William decides it's time to reclaim Northumbria, a region the Scots had lost. He believes it's their birthright. He believes the English are weakened. He believes very passionately that wind direction affects cavalry charge speed. Historians still argue whether this wind obsession was tactical or just something he yelled when things went wrong, which they often did. In 1174, he launches one of his boldest invasions yet. He storms south into English territory with a decent-sized army and a lot of misplaced confidence. You march with them, mud squishing under your boots, banners snapping overhead, spirits are high. William even tries out a new war cry by the bones of St. Cuthbert. It doesn't catch on. Here comes the main event, the Battle of Alnwick. Except it's not a battle. Not really. William, in a baffling move, sends his army one way and rides off with just a few bodyguards to scout ahead. Bad weather rolls in. Thick fog, wet cloaks, soggy maps. Then, from out of the mist, an English cavalry patrol appears small, lightly armed, and probably just as surprised to see a king alone in the wild as William is to see them. You might expect a king to turn and retreat. But William charges, roars, swings his sword, and is promptly unhorsed, tied up, and captured like a naughty student caught skipping class. England is delighted. The King of Scots is thrown in chains and paraded through the streets of Northampton, then locked up in the Tower of London like an expensive chess piece that never quite worked right. His ransom: all of Scotland's political independence. The Treaty of Falaise is signed. William must swear fealty to King Henry II of England in public, and the English place garrisons throughout Scotland. The Scots are not thrilled. Back home, William's nobles grumble. His peasants roll their eyes. His war horses probably start filing complaints. Eventually, after 15 humiliating years of being a vassal king, he pays a massive sum to regain Scotland's independence. That's the highlight of his reign, buying back dignity with money they didn't really have. You shuffle past tax collectors hitting villagers with phrases like royal necessity and we're undoing a mistake. William tries to redeem himself. He builds abbeys, reforms Scottish coinage, and commissions new laws. But people don't forget the Alnwick incident. In every tavern across the Highlands, the story is retold how the Lion of Scotland became the kitten in a cage. One fringe tale claims that while in the tower, William tried to bribe his guards with whiskey recipes, even though whiskey as we know it wouldn't be invented for centuries. Still, you kind of want it to be true, But wait, he invades England again. Yes, again. And it goes exactly as you expect. His army stumbles, starves, or is bought off. His commanders defect. One group of nobles takes a wrong turn and raids a sheep farm by accident. William blames poor communication. The nobles blame cursed winds. The sheep remain neutral. He eventually gives up on military glory and focuses on domestic rule, which, to be fair, he's slightly better at. But by then, no one's listening. The bards have already written the songs, and they're not flattering. In his final years, William grows reclusive. He becomes obsessed with building churches, perhaps in an attempt to win back divine favor. He's often found pacing near altars, muttering battle plans under his breath, occasionally asking monks whether St. Cuthbert ever got revenge. He dies in 1214 quietly, with far more lands than he conquered and far fewer friends than he started with. As you step past his tomb, weathered, moss-covered, and guarded by a single sleeping raven, you can still hear the echo of his war cry. Faint and silly by the bones of St. Cuthbert, you whispered under your breath. The raven blinks at you. Even he's not impressed. You leave behind the windswept heather of Scotland and drift southeast, past the dark woods of Bohemia, into the jewel box of Central Europe, the medieval kingdom of Bohemia, where things are a bit more gilded, a bit more mystical, and just a touch off. Welcome to the court of Wenceslaus II, King of Bohemia and briefly Poland, who, despite the saintly-sounding name, governs with all the decisiveness of a half-finished crossword puzzle. He doesn't burn things down like William or Charles. But oh, does he get weird? Tonight, you're sitting in a grand cathedral lit by stained glass moons and flickering candlelight. Wenceslaus is praying. Sort of. He's also humming, also possibly drunk. And next to him are three bearded alchemists arguing over whether you can extract gold from human hair. Let's rewind. Wenceslaus II takes the throne as a child, and early on, things look promising. Tutors say he's curious, he's quiet, thoughtful, probably going to be a philosopher king, maybe even enlightened. Unfortunately, that quiet thoughtfulness turns out to be crippling indecision, paired with an unhealthy interest in visions, relics, and miracle peddlers. The man loves a relic. At one point, he sends a royal envoy to scour cathedrals and shrines across Europe, seeking bones of saints not for worship, for inspiration. He reportedly arranges them in his chamber's skulls, femurs, fingers, and sometimes falls asleep next to them. Think of it as the original bone chic aesthetic, one confirmed obsession. The tongue of Saint Procopius, which Wenceslaus insists is whispering to him. Messages vary. Sometimes it's about divine destiny. Other times, it's just something about not trusting mirrors. Yes, he has mirror issues. According to one fringe tale, Wenceslaus believed mirrors trapped fragments of the soul. After a particularly bad military loss, he orders all reflective surfaces removed from his palace. Servants polish bronze dishes with sand so they don't shine. Foreign diplomats are banned from wearing polished armor. Courtiers start using water bowls to check their hair. You stand by a smoky hearth while a noble quietly combs his beard into the soup. It's a weird time. Wenceslaus also builds shrines everywhere. Every time he wins a battle, which, fair warning, isn't often he builds a chapel. Some towns end up with 3, just because his horse sneezed before the battle and he took it as a divine sign. Local economies can't keep up. One mayor begs him to stop donating livestock every time he dreams about halos. And then there's the royal treasury. On paper, Wenceslaus is rich. Bohemia's silver mines are booming. The Prague groschen becomes one of the most stable currencies in Europe. But instead of, say, investing in roads or armies, Wenceslaus spends the kingdom's wealth on alchemists. You descend a spiral staircase into his science cellar. It smells like fermented pears and burnt linen. Here, robed men stir bubbling cauldrons and scribble formulas on goat hide. Wenceslaus wanders among them, nodding like he understands, occasionally tossing in a silver coin for luck. One particularly bold alchemist promises he can transmute hay into gold, but only if he's paid in mead, not money. Wenceslaus agrees. A wagon of mead is delivered. No gold ever appears. The alchemist vanishes. Later, he's spotted running a tavern in Krakow called the Philosopher's Pint. You'd think the nobles might object. And, oh, they do. But the king listens to no one except one very old, very peculiar court magician who smells like onions and claims he once communed with angels inside a thundercloud. Historians still debate whether he was a visionary or just an unusually damp man. Meanwhile, real problems mount. Border skirmishes, Polish succession crises, angry German dukes, Wenceslaus's strategy fasting. He declares several holy fasts to purify the realm. During one of them, his ministers are forbidden to eat meat or speak above a whisper. One baron loudly sneezes during council. He's exiled to a goat farm for sonic misconduct. Eventually, Wenceslaus is crowned King of Poland. It's a prestigious title and one he seems baffled by. He writes poetry about it, commissions a silver goblet shaped like a question mark, but he barely visits Poland. The Polish nobility get restless. At one point, he tries ruling by carrier pigeon. It doesn't work. He dies young, just 33, possibly from tuberculosis, possibly from long-term stress. One scholar suggests it was the weight of the invisible crown. Another says he probably just never slept properly. Considering he kept jars of holy dirt under his pillow and insisted on sleeping with one eye open to avoid dream thieves, either explanation works. As you leave the candlelit corridors of Prague Castle, you pass a statue of the king holding a book, a cross, and what might be a chicken. It's hard to tell. Beneath it, an inscription reads, Sapientia sine ration est somnium. Wisdom without reason is a dream. And you think, yes. Yes, it is. From Bohemia's candlelit relic closets and philosophical poultry, you drift south to the sizzling plains of Sicily, where the citrus trees bloom year-round and the kings are unconventional, to say the least. Welcome to the 13th century court of Emperor Frederick II, a ruler so strange. Scholars still can't decide whether he was a genius, a monster, or a Renaissance man born way too early. You arrive at his court expecting discipline, hierarchy, and a few executions. What you get is a science fair hosted by someone who thinks birds are diplomats. Frederick was Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, and King of Germany, and while that sounds impressive, he ruled like a kid who got bored halfway through every history book and just started making stuff up. He speaks 6 languages. He writes treatises on falconry and digestion. He establishes one of the earliest universities in Europe, and also casually threatens to excommunicate the Pope. Twice. Maybe 3 times. He loses count. You meet him in Palermo. He's barefoot in a silk robe, surrounded by cages of birds, scribes, and an elephant that may or may not belong to the Sultan of Egypt. Someone plays a lute. Someone else is dissecting a lizard. You nod politely. Frederick adored falcons. His court kept hundreds. Entire wings of the palace were aviaries. He once dictated royal policy while a hawk perched on his wrist. And you get the feeling he trusted the hawk more than half his advisors. One source even claims he offered diplomatic gifts of trained falcons instead of gold. 1 falcon per treaty, 2 for a truce. Some countries just stopped responding. And then there's the infamous battle chicken experiment. According to a fringe but widely beloved tale, Frederick became obsessed with proving that instinct could be manipulated by environment. He had armor crafted for roosters and staged fights between them in a tiny coliseum. Nobles placed bets. A philosopher declared it deeply symbolic. Ha! A priest called it chicken heresy. Frederick just took notes. He also experimented on language specifically, how it develops. In one disturbing case, he allegedly ordered infants to be raised without human speech to see whether they would naturally speak Hebrew, Greek, or Arabic. They didn't. They just didn't speak. Historians still argue over the truth of this, but it's brought up at every Frederick-themed dinner party. You follow him into a private chamber filled with clocks, globes, taxidermy snakes, and a chair carved like a griffin. Here, he unveils a letter from the Pope. It's a threat. Again. The Pope's mad because Frederick's crusade didn't involve much crusading. See, Frederick once launched a crusade without bloodshed. He sailed to the Holy Land, negotiated with Muslim leaders, and walked into Jerusalem without fighting a single battle. He even briefly crowned himself King of Jerusalem. No approval from the Pope, no armies, just swagger and political weirdness. The church was livid. That's not how a crusade works. They said. Frederick shrugged, probably while feeding grapes to a hawk. Even more confusing, he spent as much time fighting Italian cities and other Christians as he did defending Christendom. His enemies claimed he was the Antichrist. He didn't help his case by writing a book called On the Art of Hunting with Birds and refusing to attend Mass when he was busy debating Islamic scholars about whether angels breathe. He also collected court poets, philosophers, mathematicians, and astrologers like other kings collected jewels. His court became a magnet for thinkers, a kind of medieval TED Talk with more incense and fewer microphones. One day he's translating Aristotle. The next, he's accusing a monk of stealing his favorite parrot. Speaking of parrots, Frederick believed in animal diplomacy. He once tried to ease tensions with a rival kingdom by sending a talking parrot trained to recite his family lineage and say, "Long live Frederick" in Latin, Arabic, and, for some reason, Occitan. It reportedly flew away mid-delivery. The peace talks failed. By the end of his life, Frederick was both feared and worshipped. The Sicilians adored his intellect. The Germans respected his charisma. The papacy, well, they excommunicated him multiple times, eventually declaring him damned and calling him the beast of the apocalypse. That might be a bit of a stretch, but he did once publish a law code while in a full peacock feather cloak. He dies in 1250, likely of dysentery or complications from malaria. One legend says he planned his death, choosing a prophetic date and slipping away while holding a falcon's feather. Others say his death was faked, and he rides with Odin now, or possibly underground. With chickens, you walk through his crumbling palace, half observatory, half aviary, and hear the wind rustle the ghost feathers of history. Above the door is a carving Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. And you realize they weren't sure if it was a compliment. You stumble out of Frederick's falcon-flecked fever dream and back into the damp grayness of 14th century England, where the streets of London clatter with wooden carts, and the nobles wear expressions that say, "Please don't mention gold robes again." Because tonight, you're heading into the reign of Richard II, the boy king who wanted to rule like a god, dress like a chandelier, and eventually got overthrown while inspecting shrubbery. Richard takes the throne in 1377 at the tender age of 10, which already sets the tone for disaster. He grows up surrounded by power-hungry uncles, corrupt ministers, and an increasingly rebellious peasantry. And while he does learn to speak well and ride horses properly, what he really falls in love with is pageantry. You see him in Westminster Hall, bathed in candlelight and wrapped in fabrics so finely embroidered they could double as doilies for angels. He's wearing gold head to toe, gold robe, gold boots, even gold-threaded undergarments. If rumors are true, one courtier whispers, he looks like a melted chalice. You nod solemnly. But Richard doesn't just dress the part he believes he is the part. Not a man ruling by consent of nobles, but a divinely appointed being, halfway between king and deity. He sits in court like a statue carved from pride, and delivers royal proclamations as though they were thunderbolts, light ones, laced with poetry. Early on, there's hope. During the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, Richard, just 14, meets the rebels himself. He speaks calmly, he promises reforms, he faces them in person while his ministers cower behind stone walls. Then he breaks every promise. The moment the crowd disperses, Richard rounds up the leaders and has them executed. Efficient, yes, honorable. Not so much. It sets the tone for his adult reign's smooth words. Velvet gloves, iron daggers. By the time he hits his 20s, Richard surrounds himself with flatterers, artists, and a personal choir. He commissions mirrors for every hallway, so he can admire himself at all angles. One fringe account claims he had a favorite mirror which traveled with him. Guarded by 2 squires and wrapped in fur. But he's not just vain, he's volatile. When the nobles criticize his spending, Richard responds by bankrupting the treasury on an elaborate coronation redo. Yes, he was crowned as a child, but now that he's grown, he wants to do it properly with more gold, more trumpets, and possibly a live unicorn none available, but a very shiny goat is used in its place. Parliament is horrified. He ignores them. He creates a personal guard of 300 liveried retainers, loyal only to him. His critics call it a private army. His supporters call it tasteful security. One guard wears a hat shaped like a sunburst. Another is rumored to carry a perfume sprayer for royal moods. And then there's the art. Richard II is the first English king to commission a portrait of himself in full regalia, posed like a Byzantine icon. It's not subtle. Haloed, radiant, hands raised like a saint. He doesn't just want to be remembered, he wants to be worshipped. Meanwhile, the realm suffers. France raids the coast. Ireland rebels. Nobles feud. Richard. He's hosting garden pageants. Literally. There's one memorable moment where foreign ambassadors arrive to negotiate a treaty and find the king inspecting topiary dragons while dressed in silver slippers. "You're there," you hear him say. "The leaves are pleasingly melancholic today." The ambassador clears his throat and asks about ships. Richard offers a poem. Eventually, enough is enough. Enter Henry Bolingbroke, cousin to the king and decidedly less interested in poetry. When Richard exiles Henry and seizes his lands, the nobles see their moment. Henry returns from France, raises an army, and lands in Yorkshire. Richard is away in Ireland fighting a rebellion. Yes, but also reportedly searching for enchanted oak trees. He returns to find the country already turning against him. He retreats to the Tower, then flees, then tries to negotiate. Then famously he's found in a garden, admiring the hedges. His guards lower their weapons. The nobles close in. Richard stares at the sky and says, "I see my fall in that cloud." It's the most poetic coup in English history. He's forced to abdicate in 1399. Henry Bolingbroke becomes Henry IV. Richard is imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, where he paces endlessly, refuses food, composes sad verses, and talks to a tapestry. Historians still debate how he died. Starvation Murder one tale says he was beaten to death with a poker. Another claims he simply wasted away, too proud to ask for bread. You pass the room where he breathed his last. It's cold. Stark. No gold. No mirrors. Just a faint echo, like the rustle of silk or the last line of a forgotten poem. And there you remember Richard II didn't lose his crown in battle. He styled it away one embroidered fantasy at a time. You drift east now, past fields striped with frost and forests that hum with the low growl of forgotten wars, until you reach the jagged borderlands of Moldavia, modern-day Romania. The year is 1475 and the moon is full. Probably ominous, definitely dramatic, because here waits Stephen the Great, voivode of Moldavia, and the man who might have been a national hero if he weren't also a wildly obsessive church-building battle addict. You arrive in the aftermath of yet another victory. Bodies buried, banners half furled. And Stephen, he's off in a corner sketching plans for his next monastery. See, Stephen had a rule, a deeply personal, vaguely mystical, and utterly exhausting rule: build a church after every victory. Every single time. So far, he's built 44. 44 churches, monasteries, chapels, and shrines, each commemorating some small or large triumph in his relentless campaign against Turks, Hungarians, Wallachians, or frankly, anyone who looked at Moldavia sideways. Now, at first glance, he seems heroic. He defeats massive Ottoman armies with small, nimble forces. He launches guerrilla raids like a medieval ninja. Even the Pope calls him Athleta Christi, Champion of Christ. But when you look closer, the pattern gets weirder. Stephen treats warfare like a divine checklist. Did I win? Yes. Build a chapel. Did I win again? Great. Build one with stained glass? Lost a battle? Doesn't count. That was a trial from God. And this isn't just superstition, it becomes government policy. You're sitting in a war council. The general says, "We've secured the pass." Stephen nods, then pulls out a blueprint for a bell tower. The treasurer groans. The bishop cheers. A scribe faints because they just ran out of parchment. But it's not just building. Stephen has another obsession: his mother. Reportedly, before any decision whether to go to war, sign a treaty, or have soup, he consults his mother. Altea, she lives in a monastery, so she's cloaked in black. And her advice, always cryptic. "My son," she says, "stirring a pot of mysterious herbs. If the wolf dances, watch the moon." Stephen nods. Next morning, 5,000 Ottoman troops are ambushed in a gorge. Historians still argue whether Altea was a savvy strategist or just extremely lucky with metaphors. But behind the folklore is something darker. Stephen doesn't just win wars, he punishes cities. Take Chilia, a port town that once betrayed him. After capturing it, he orders it razed, then personally blesses the burning ruins while monks chant psalms behind him. He's not doing this for fun. He's doing it for order. A fringe tale claims that after one betrayal, he had the guilty boyar's nobles executed one by one, then made the survivors watch while seated at a feast. Each time a head rolled, another course was served. You sit there now, ghost-like, as a servant quietly replaces the soup. One noble weeps into his roast duck. You want to believe it's an exaggeration? But with Stephen, maybe not. Even his foreign diplomacy is unnerving. He tries peaceful letters, at first florid, Latin-heavy prose addressed to kings and emperors. But if those don't work, he sends nosebags, as in bags of severed noses from enemy scouts. Delivered with a note next time. Send ambassadors. One Ottoman general receives a bag and reportedly faints. Stephen's paranoia isn't totally misplaced. Moldavia is tiny, sandwiched between enemies. If he lets up even for a season, someone invades. So he becomes obsessively strategic, setting forests on fire to block cavalry, digging pits filled with spikes, flooding fields to slow enemy wagons. Even his peasants are trained to scatter and destroy food stores if an invasion comes. Burn your own crops. Poison the wells. Deny them everything. But even his people start to grow weary. It's been decades. The churches keep rising. The wars keep returning. And the man they call the Great walks among the ruins, face carved with lines, muttering prayers, tallying his wins. Sometimes, it's hard to tell if he's leading a country or simply building a living monument to himself. In one of his final campaigns, he returns victorious but ill. He orders one last chapel, a small one. Quiet, no towers. The artisans work in silence. Stephen sits nearby, eyes half closed, mumbling architectural advice. Use ash wood, like my first. He dies in 1504, buried in Putnam Monastery, his favorite creation. His tomb reads, "Here lies Stephen, who ruled with an iron arm and a trembling soul." You stand by the stone, chilled not by the wind but by the sheer longevity of his rage. And as you leave Moldavia's misty hills, you pass a tiny stone church. No roof, no door. Just a plaque built after the skirmish near the river. 1472. No one remembers the battle. But the church remains. That's the real legacy. Not the blood, not the borders. Just chapel. After chapel, after chapel. You float westward now, over ridged hills and mist-swept Pyrenees, and into the richly embroidered corridors of 14th century France. The ceilings are high, the perfume is overwhelming, and the politics absolutely radioactive. Because at the heart of it all is Philip IV, better known as Philip the Fair, a man whose face could sell statues, but whose soul might have been carved out of stone. You find him sitting perfectly still beneath a vaulted ceiling, light catching the edges of his silver-threaded robes. He looks like a painting come to life. And for a second, you think, maybe this one's different. Maybe this king is calm, capable, a peaceful administrator. Then he opens his mouth and declares war on the Pope. Philip IV wasn't just cold. He was ice-sculptured diplomatic warfare. Everything he did was measured, deliberate, and frequently catastrophic in the long run. He didn't scream. He didn't flail. He didn't trip over his own feet. No. Philip was the kind of king who could walk into a room, say 5 words, and start a century-long conflict. Let's start with his finances. He needed money, lots of it. Wars are expensive. Castles are expensive. Feathered wall hangings apparently are extremely expensive. So, what did Philip do? First, he taxes the clergy. Bold, illegal, highly inflammatory. The Pope at the time, Boniface VIII, tells him to back off. Philip replies by printing propaganda leaflets accusing the Pope of heresy, devil worship, and maybe eating babies. Okay, maybe not babies. But you get the tone. Things escalate. The Pope excommunicates Philip. Philip sends a group of soldiers to kidnap the Pope. Yes, kidnap. The soldiers beat him, and he dies a month later from the shock. Historians still argue whether Philip ordered the beating directly or just winked too hard at his men. You sit in the corner of the palace library, flipping through a royal decree while scribes scurry past. Philip is writing a doctrine that essentially says, the king is above the Pope. You look up. A scribe faints. Another keeps writing, but slower now. Philip moves on to his next project, the Knights Templar. Now, you've probably heard of them. Crusading monks. Secret rituals. That weird symbol your cousin got tattooed on his calf. Well, by the 1300s, the Templars aren't fighting much. They're bankers, and very rich ones. Philip, very not rich? You see the issue? So, in 1307, he rounds them up. Across France, Templar knights are arrested, tortured, and forced to confess to a laundry list of horrors, spitting on crosses, kissing goats, summoning demons. It's like the medieval version of a tabloid meltdown. Most of it's made up, but it works. Philip seizes their assets, disbands the order with help from a terrified new pope, and executes the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, by burning him alive in public. As the flames rise, de Molay reportedly shouts a curse on Philip, on the pope, on all their descendants. And here's where things get weirdly poetic. Over the next 14 years, Philip, the pope, and Philip's 3 sons all die one after another. Boom. 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 It's so suspiciously tidy that chroniclers start whispering, the curse is real. Even today. Historians refer to this stretch as the Accursed Kings era. No proof of magic, of course, but the timing is suspicious enough to earn a whole historical franchise. Philip, despite his chilly brilliance, may have set fire to the future of France just to balance a few ledgers and stroke his ego. There's a lesser-known tidbit, too. Philip's cloud excommunication. One chronicled but highly disputed moment has Philip standing in a thunderstorm after his fallout with the Vatican. He raises his hand, looks to the sky, and excommunicates a cloud. Not metaphorically, like literally says, "You too betray me," to a particularly dramatic cloud bank over the Loire Valley. Was it symbolic a joke, a sign of royal stress, historians still argue? One fringe account claims he then refused to walk under shadows for 2 weeks, fearing celestial revenge. Another says he commissioned an astrologer to calculate when the sky might forgive him. Answer, probably never. Philip dies in 1314 after a sudden hunting accident. Some say it was a stroke. Others say his horse threw him. Either way, it wasn't noble, it wasn't poetic, and it definitely wasn't part of the plan. The man who thought in decades, who battled popes and buried knights, ended up buried in haste. His legacy tangled in both law codes and curses. You step quietly through the now empty council chamber. The documents are still here. The ink has dried. The power plays echo faintly in the rafters. Outside, storm clouds gather again. Better not speak too loudly. That one's looking straight at you. The sky clears, the air thins, and you descend southward into Leon, medieval Spain, where the landscape rolls with golden hills and low, crumbling towers that seem to crouch under the sun like they know something embarrassing happened here. Welcome to the reign of Sancho Furin of Leon, also known less officially but quite unshakably as Sancho the Short. You don't call him that to his face. You meet him in the throne room, which is built to emphasize grandeur, high arches, wide steps, a dais that towers above the court. Except there's a problem. Sancho's throne is too tall. Literally. He climbs it with the help of a wooden crate hidden behind the velvet. You watch him do it, one short leg after another, robes flapping, grumbling about overambitious carpentry. When he finally sits, his feet don't touch the floor. He swings them. Slightly. Now, being short isn't a sin. But for a medieval king obsessed with strength, virility, and leading armies on horseback, it's a bit of a branding issue. His rivals call him the Toddler King. One chronicler cruelly describes him as having the face of a man and the build of a butter churn. Sancho tries to compensate with armor, heavy, engraved, and wildly oversized. His helmet slips over his eyes when he nods. His sword is taller than he is. Once, during a joust, he had to be hoisted onto the saddle by two stable boys in a pulley system. The horse was not consulted. You march with his army sort of. You're mostly watching from behind a cart of smoked almonds. Sancho's war councils are held from atop a barrel, which gives him a slight height advantage and an unfortunate wobble. During one heated strategy session, he loses his balance and falls mid-sentence into a basket of apples. No one moves for a moment. Then someone coughs. A bishop starts clapping, awkwardly. Sancho waves it off, just testing the ripeness. Despite these mishaps, Sancho does lead actual campaigns. He fights the Moors, wages skirmishes with Castile, and spends a lot of time arguing over land that technically belongs to his cousins. He has a complicated relationship with alliances, often making peace treaties one day and launching surprise attacks the next. One historian described his diplomacy as like throwing dice during an earthquake. But what really undoes Sancho is his health. He suffers from extreme obesity, possibly a glandular disorder or hypothyroidism. Over time, his weight balloons to the point where he can't ride a horse, can't walk more than a few feet, and has to be carried to ceremonies on a wooden platform by four very unhappy monks. And this is where the legend gets particularly strange. Desperate to keep power and respect, Sancho turns to unorthodox medicine. You find him in a monastery outside Lyon, surrounded by Moorish physicians, a Greek nutritionist, and one terrifying woman from the Pyrenees who calls herself La Sangradora the Bleeder. Their treatment plan, a terrifying combination of fasting, chanting, bloodletting, and eating nothing but herbs and melted pork fat. For weeks, Sancho lies in a hammock, sweating and chanting, while monks recite psalms in the background. He loses weight, a lot of it, so much that rumors swirl he's not the same man. One noble sees him months later and whispers, "It's either a miracle or a cousin in disguise." There's even a fringe story that Sancho died during the treatment, and the man ruling afterward was a body double with a fake mole drawn on each morning with ink and goat milk. Historians still argue whether the timeline supports this theory or whether people were just deeply uncomfortable with the glow-up. Either way, slimmed-down Sancho returns to Leon and attempts a grand re-entrance. Trumpets, flowers, heralds yelling things like, "Witness the transformation." The problem: the throne still doesn't fit. Someone forgot to adjust the seat height. Sancho steps up, misjudges, and sits down into empty air. The court gasps. He collapses sideways onto a serving tray of roasted quail. And that sadly becomes the lasting image. He dies not long after, possibly from infection, possibly from overexertion, possibly from sheer embarrassment. His legacy is tangled. Some say he was brave. Others say he was ridiculous. A few say he ruled with quiet dignity, but most just remember the barrel, the apples, and the day the king fell off his own throne. As you leave the royal crypt beneath Lyon's cracked cathedral, a boy sells tiny wooden barrels carved with Sancho fur on the side. You ask him what they're for. He shrugs. Salt or kings. You head north once more, across the choppy waters of the North Sea, and into the land of fog and feuds Anglo-Saxon England, just before the Norman conquest. It's a land of longboats, low fires, and high-stakes family squabbles. And at the center of it all is Harold Harefoot, a king whose entire rule feels like someone yelling, "I call shotgun," while the rightful heir is in the bathroom. Harold's reign isn't long, just 5 chaotic years from 1035 to 1040, but oh, it's spectacularly awkward. You arrive in a court that feels like it's always in the middle of a tense family reunion. Half the nobles are muttering, the other half are glaring, and Harold is pretending he belongs on the throne, which he kind of doesn't. Let's rewind. The real king, Knut the Great, has just died? Yes, that Knut the Danish king who once tried to command the tide. Knut had 2 sons, Harold, born to his English mistress, and Harthacnut, born to his proper royal Danish wife. Harthacnut is away in Denmark at the time, dealing with Viking stuff. You know, long ships, frozen mustaches, taxes made of fish. So Harold, being the more local son, does what any ambitious half-brother might do. He slides into the role of king before anyone can stop him. The nobles raise eyebrows, the church mumbles. Harold holds a quick coronation without his brother's approval and calls himself regent at first. But pretty soon, he drops the modesty act and starts signing things as king. Harold Harefoot, King of England, just rolls right off the stolen tongue. Historians still argue whether he was acting out of political necessity or just seizing the moment like a medieval stagecrasher. Either way, you're now watching a man try to solidify his claim while constantly looking over his shoulder. Literally. In portraits, he's almost always turned halfway, as if someone might interrupt at any moment. He tries to win support by handing out lavish gifts to the nobility. Problem is, he doesn't have that much money. So the gifts start getting weird. A goose with a gold-painted beak, a silver comb shaped like Thor, a suit of mail made of boiled leather which collapses in the rain. Still, it kind of works. Enough nobles back him to keep things going. But there's one person who is not on team Harold Queen Emma, his stepmother and mother of the absent Harthacnut. Emma is not subtle about her feelings. She basically calls Harold illegitimate, unfit, and unpleasant. In that order, she flees to Bruges in protest because nothing says your rule is fake like a royal mom, packing up her tiaras and leaving the country. Harold doesn't take it well. He seizes Emma's lands. He seizes her jewelry. He seizes her personal library, which allegedly includes a book of dream interpretations and a cookbook with the suspicious number of eel recipes. He posts guards at her estates and rebrands her favorite manor house as Knut's castle, even though Knut hated it there. Then comes the Christmas incident. You're at court. The fire's crackling, roasted boar on the spit, and in walks Alfred Etheling, son of Emma and half-brother to both Harold and Harthacnut. He's back from Normandy with a small entourage, possibly to reclaim his birthright, possibly just to visit Mom. The records are foggy. Harold is not pleased. He invites Alfred to stay a while, and by stay, he means arrest and blind. Harold has him seized, his men slaughtered, and Alfred himself mutilated, allegedly with red-hot pokers. The poor man dies days later. It's one of the most brutal political messages in early English history. You stare at the fire as the court eats in silence. Someone passes you a dish. You politely decline. Harold's popularity dips, but he hangs on. Harthacnut, still in Denmark, is delayed by storms and political baggage. Harold's enemies say he's cursed. His supporters say he's lucky. You say this feels like the build-up to a dramatic sibling reunion. Except it never happens. In 1040, just as Harthacnut prepares to finally invade England and reclaim his crown, Harold dies. Suddenly. Quietly. No battle. No showdown. Just a death. The cause unknown. Some say disease, some say poison. One fringe tale claims he was haunted to death by the ghost of Alfred Ethling, who whispered thief from under the floorboards until Harold collapsed with fear. Probably not true, but it is the most memorable version. At his funeral, attendance is thin. Harthacnut arrives just in time to order the body dug up, beheaded, and tossed in a swamp. No eulogies, no second chances, just vengeance. Brother style. And so you stand now beside the murky bog that swallowed a usurper. The reeds whisper. A frog stares at you too long. You wonder if Harold still floats under the surface, grumbling about stepmothers and royal furniture. It's not the worst rain you've seen tonight, but it's definitely the pettiest. You follow the river south again, down into the heart of the Carolingian Empire's soggy leftovers, into a kingdom that is somehow both majestic and laughably unstable. You're in West Francia, sometime in the 9th century, when France is still figuring out what it even is, and the nobles can't decide if they're allies or breakfast. Enter Charles the Bald, whose name sounds like an insult but is actually a bureaucratic convenience. See, there were so many Charleses floating around that historians needed to start labeling them by hair, geography, or general vibes. And Charles. He got the bald, though he wasn't necessarily bald. You step into his palace, it's raining inside. Literally. The roof leaks. A monk scurries by with a bucket. And Charles. He's sitting on a throne that squeaks every time he moves, trying to write decrees while pretending the whole place isn't held together by parchment and nervous hope. Charles was the grandson of Charlemagne, and boy did that come with pressure. Everyone expected glory. They got constant invasions, confused allegiances, and a king who may or may not have worn a wig woven from monk hair fringe theory, but delightfully specific. His reign begins with a mess. The empire is divided among Charlemagne's heirs, and Charles ends up with the western chunk. Except everyone else wants it too. His brothers, his nephews, local lords, angry bishops. It's a revolving door of betrayal. At one point, he's crowned king twice in 2 weeks, just to reinforce it. Both ceremonies include chanting, sword raising, and awkward silence while they adjust the crown again. He tries to look regal. The crown tilts sideways. A jester coughs too loudly. One of Charles's more endearing quirks. He talks to bells. Yes. According to a fringe chronicler, Charles believes certain bells, especially those in monasteries, held divine moods. Before battles, he would consult the bells. 1 clang. Good omen. 2 clangs. Wait until sunrise. No clangs. Probably a betrayal on the horizon. You watch him pace before a bell tower. He whispers, "What say you?" "Old friend." The bell remains still. Charles cancels the meeting. It would be funny if the stakes weren't so high. Viking raids are brutal. In 845, Ragnar Lodbrok himself, yes. The guy you've probably seen in historical dramas sails up the Seine and sacks Paris. Charles tries to rally defenses, but ends up paying 7,000 pounds of silver to make the Vikings go away. That's not a battle strategy. That's a ransom receipt. The nobles groan. The peasants groan louder. Charles commissions a new set of defensive measures, including watchtowers, river blockades, and a long pamphlet on moral conduct. The Vikings come back anyway. He also introduces a law code that's so long and so complicated that even his scribes get bored. At one point, a scribe doodles a small duck in the margin beside a paragraph about tax exemptions for poultry keepers. You stare at it. The duck looks more confident than the king. Charles's big problem, though, is loyalty or lack thereof. No one seems to stick around. His vassals switch sides constantly. He grants them land, titles, prayers, and sometimes custom-made bed linens, but they still vanish at the first sign of trouble. One noble, Count Bernard, is given control of Aquitaine. 2 weeks later, Bernard declares himself a king of Aquitaine. Charles sends an army. Bernard hides in a monastery. Charles forgives him. Bernard tries again. It's like a soap opera directed by a sheep. There's also the awkward alliance with the church. Charles desperately needs church support to keep control, so he promises protection, gold, and fancy relics. But then he accidentally sells church land to a merchant in exchange for war horses. The bishops get mad. Charles claims it was a clerical error. The merchant names his new estate bishops Bargain Pasture. Toward the end of his reign, Charles decides to crown his son as co-ruler to smooth succession. It works about as well as everything else. His son immediately starts acting like the real king, issuing orders, dismissing counselors, and once calling his father tired-looking. Charles sighs. He's not bald, but emotionally, very bald. Then comes his death. He's riding through the Alps in 877, freezing, sick, and surrounded by advisors who are arguing about whose cloak is furrier. Charles suddenly collapses, possibly from a fever, possibly from despair. One legend almost certainly false, but Delightful claims he was killed by a wild boar who hated his tax policy. You pass by his modest grave, no gold, no statues, just a worn slab. Someone scratched into the stone. Here lies Charles, who ruled when ruling was impossible. And maybe that's true. But next time, check the bells. Now you shift slightly south, following the Iberian sun into the heart of medieval Castile. The skies are cloudless, the roads dusty, and the court is oddly quiet. That's because the man in charge, Alfonso Sex, also known as Alfonso the Wise, is upstairs, deep in philosophical thought, composing a poem about planetary motion while everyone else is screaming about famine and war. Alfonso is called the Wise for a reason. He's brilliant, probably one of the smartest kings of the Middle Ages. He speaks multiple languages, reads Greek and Arabic, and writes about astronomy, law, and chess. He even dabbles in translating ancient texts and wants to turn Castile into the Oxford of the West. Unfortunately, none of this helps when your kingdom is on fire. You arrive at the court in Toledo, and it's bustling, not with ministers, but with scribes and monks carrying scrolls about the movement of stars and philosophical treatises on the soul. Meanwhile, a delegation of nobles storms down the corridor, shouting about overdue wages and rebel uprisings. They ask to see the king. A page peeks into the royal study and returns, whispering he's revising his treatise on the medicinal properties of quartz. The nobles groan, one mutters. Maybe the quartz can pay the army. Here's the thing, Alfonso isn't bad in the usual ways. He doesn't throw temper tantrums often, or behead his brothers immediately, or dance naked in the rain. That's a different king. Instead, he's a tragic mismatch, a philosopher forced to do politics, and a king who never quite figured out how to balance dreams with droughts. For example, one of his proudest projects is the Siete Partidas, a sprawling legal code that tried to systematize Castilian law with logic, fairness, and Roman inspiration. It's beautiful. It's brilliant. It's also so complex that no one understands it. Local judges ignore it. The peasants laugh at it. One mayor in Galicia reportedly used it to fix a broken door hinge. Alfonso shrugs and starts a new volume on music theory. Meanwhile, the kingdom groans. A civil war brews between Alfonso and his own son, Sancho. Why? Because Alfonso named his dead son's son, his grandson, as his heir. Bypassing the very much alive Sancho? Everyone is confused. Sancho is furious. The nobles pick sides. The family tree becomes a boxing bracket. Historians still debate whether Alfonso did this out of love for the grandson, fear of Sancho, or simply because he got distracted midway through reading the inheritance laws and never finished. You attend a tense royal dinner. Sancho sulks. Alfonso talks about the moons of Jupiter. Someone sneezes. The tension is thick enough to be carved and served as dessert. There's a fringe tale that Alfonso once tried to design a new calendar, believing the existing one was too emotionally rigid. He consulted astronomers, theologians, and a goat herder known for his lunar predictions. The plan was abandoned after 3 weeks, but not before a royal decree rebranded Tuesday as Mill Day. It never caught on. Then there's the Toledo School of Translators, a genuine highlight. Alfonso gathers scholars from across the religious spectrum. Christians, Muslims, Jews. Together they translate ancient texts, debate philosophy, and drink wine. It's basically a think tank with better robes. Alfonso is thrilled. But while this cultural renaissance unfolds inside the palace, the countryside is starving. Crops fail, taxes rise, roads crumble. The military is underfunded. Alfonso issues royal edicts demanding peace. The rebels send him a wheel of cheese filled with bees. No one knows what it means. As the civil war intensifies, Alfonso flees to Seville, hoping to regroup. Instead, he isolates himself further. He composes sad poetry, studies the stars, and writes letters to foreign kings asking for support. Most of them reply with something like, "Sounds hard. Good luck." One of his final obsessions. The Alphonsine table's astronomical charts that calculate planetary positions with impressive precision. He funds their creation obsessively, even as his treasury dries up. A frustrated noble once asked, "Can the stars feed our children?" Alfonso reportedly replied, "Not directly." Eventually, Sancho takes power by force. Alfonso dies in exile in 1284, surrounded by books, maps, and no political allies whatsoever. You step through his dusty library. A book of Castilian verse lies open on the table. Nearby, a half-finished chessboard awaits a move that will never come. Etched in the margin of one manuscript are his most famous words. "If the Lord Almighty had consulted me before embarking upon the creation, I should have recommended something simpler." And you think, same. Alfonso, you drift northeast now. The warm Iberian winds fading behind you as the Baltic air wraps you in cold breath and old myths. The forests are dense here, the rivers wide and dark, and the castles look like they were carved out of iron. You're in the 14th century Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and your host tonight is Vytautas the Great. Sounds promising, right? The great implies triumph, wisdom, and legacy. And yes, Vytautas fought bravely, outlived his rivals, and carved a spot for Lithuania on the map. But what people often gloss over is this: he forgot to rule half the time. You step into his fortress at Trakai, past walls that still smell faintly of wolf pelts and burnt honey. Vytautas isn't in his chambers. He's not in council. He's not even hunting. He's out dueling the Teutonic Knights. Again, Vytautas, you quickly learn, has a one-track mind war. Not strategy, not logistics, just war. Preferably against Germans. Specifically the Teutonic Order. Doesn't matter if it's winter, harvest season, or his own coronation day if there's a Teutonic patrol near the border. He's mounting a horse and galloping off with a sword in his teeth. You follow him across muddy fields. He charges into battle without a helmet, shouting curses in Old Lithuanian that may or may not involve livestock. He wins, often. He loses, occasionally. But every fight ends with the same result: he builds nothing. No taxes reformed. No roads built. No time for actual governing. Meanwhile, his nobles are back home, improvising laws. One village declares its own currency, acorn-based. Another sets up a regional council made of retired bards. No one tells Vytautas. They know he won't care. Back in court, you watch a debate over grain prices devolve into a duel using dried sausages. The treasurer sighs. If only the Duke would sit still long enough to read a ledger. He never does. Vytautas is obsessed with legacy, but in the most dramatic way possible. He wants to be crowned king, not just Grand Duke. But there's a snag: Lithuania is in a shaky union with Poland, and any solo coronation risks breaking that alliance. So what does he do? He plans a secret coronation anyway? Yes, in 1430, Vytautas secretly sends messengers to the Holy Roman Emperor asking for a crown. The emperor agrees. A golden crown is forged, processions are planned, trumpets tuned. Then plot twist: the crown is intercepted. By Polish agents? That's right. The crown never arrives. It's taken mid-transit. Possibly hidden in a Polish monastery. Possibly thrown in a river. No one really knows. One fringe account claims it was melted down and turned into decorative buttons for a bishop's winter coat. Vytautas, already in his ceremonial robes, waits and waits. No crown, no coronation, just silence. He rages, throws goblets, and reportedly kicks over a tapestry. His coronation banquet turns into a very awkward dinner. He dies not long after. Still technically Grand Duke, but never king. His final days are spent grumbling about Polish conspiracies and staring into the fire like it owes him something. And then there's the thing with his people. You see, while Vytautas was off collecting battle scars, Lithuania faced famine. Whole regions suffered from bad harvests, banditry, and plague. But instead of addressing it, Vytautas responded with horse races. He believed speed competitions would raise morale. In one case, he awarded the winner of a horse race with land that technically already belonged to someone else. The dispute lasted 15 years. The horse got a statue, even when he tried diplomacy. Vytautas had a flair for the dramatic. Once, during treaty negotiations with the Teutonic Order, he entered the hall in full armor, sat down, and refused to remove his helmet for the entire 6-hour discussion. He only spoke once, want to say. Truth requires no face. Everyone just nodded and avoided eye contact. He also once sent a peace delegation to Moscow consisting entirely of clergy, musicians, and one bear. The bear, dressed in a ceremonial tunic, reportedly bit a Muscovite official. The treaty fell through. Still, for all his chaos, Vytautas did manage something incredible. He held Lithuania together, even if it was with raw charisma and occasional threats involving catapults. Under him, it became the largest state in Europe, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. He didn't feed everyone. He didn't organize much, but he scared away just enough enemies, won just enough battles, and glittered just brightly enough to keep the whole rickety thing upright. As you leave his fortress, you pass a dusty chamber where a moldy crown-shaped cushion still waits. The real crown never arrived. But maybe, for Vytautas, the idea of the crown was always more satisfying than the reality. You make one final drift, east across the Carpathians and into the lowlands of medieval Hungary. The air is thick with the scent of smoke and lard. The palaces squat and brooding, the rivers tired and slow. It is here among broken pacts, blood-stained pillows, and confused scribes that you meet Bela II, also known as Bela the Blind, ruler of Hungary from 1131 to 1141 and perhaps the least personally aware king you've met all night. You walk into his court, and it's immediately clear something is off. The king sits still, his eyes cloudy, his crown slightly askew. He wears the expression of someone perpetually halfway between a nap and a prophecy. Around him, his wife Queen Helena does most of the talking, also the ruling, also, possibly the avenging. Let's back up. Bela wasn't born blind. He was blinded as a child by his uncle, King Koloman, who wanted to eliminate all potential rivals to the throne. The job was carried out in the usual subtle medieval way, hot irons and betrayal. Somehow, Bela survives. But now he's eyeless, out of succession, and growing up in a monastery where monks teach him to pray and forget. He does not forget. Years later, the political winds shift. The reigning king, Stephen II, dies without an heir. The nobles need a bloodline candidate. And wouldn't you know it, Bela, now grown, married, and very conveniently related, is next in line. So in 1131, Bela the Blind becomes king of Hungary. But here's the twist: he's king, but not in control. You see, Queen Helena. She remembers everything. Every insult, every betrayal, every burned letter. And on the day of Bela's coronation, she invites all the nobles to a grand feast. There's wine, roast pork, music. Then she locks the doors and reads off a list. It's a list of everyone who betrayed her husband, the ones who stood by while he was blinded, the ones who benefited, the ones who stayed silent. Name after name. She calls them forward. One by one. They are executed, right there in the banquet hall. Some say Bela wept. Others say he smiled faintly. A few claim he simply continued eating. Historians still argue whether he ordered it, condoned it, or was simply brought the leftovers. From that moment, the message is clear. Helena rules, and Bela is her voice. Maybe. Sometimes he rarely speaks in public. He rarely leaves the castle. Most decrees come through the queen's hand. When nobles speak to Bela, he tilts his head as if listening to something behind the air. Occasionally, he answers with a proverb no one quite understands. But let's talk about his policies, such as they are. There's one bright spot: Bela supports the church. Lavishly. Probably too lavishly. He gives away lands, builds monasteries, and hands out relics like they're door prizes. One monk receives a gold crucifix, a horse, and allegedly a bag of cinnamon just for saying a particularly flattering psalm. But then come the famine years. Grain prices soar, bandits multiply, nobles tax the peasants into oblivion. Helena issues proclamations against price gouging. No one listens. One baron names himself Duke of Wheat. Another hoards flour and builds a fortress made of bread bricks. Okay, that last one might be exaggerated, but it made the chronicles. And what's Bela doing during this? According to one account, he's carving wooden chess pieces, blindfolded. They're surprisingly good. The court applauds. Meanwhile, foreign relations collapse, Croatia revolting, Serbia furious. The Holy Roman Emperor sends a letter. Bela responds with a blank sheet of parchment. Wax seal perfectly pressed. Was it a diplomatic snub? An accident or just a scribe trying to finish early that day? No one knows. One fringe legend tells of a day when Bela was asked about a potential alliance. He nodded, then said, "Let the ox lead the oxen." The ambassador blinked. "So, that's a yes, it is a statement," Bela replied. Still, his rule stumbles forward. Hungary doesn't collapse, but it definitely limps. Local governors begin operating like independent kings. The treasury runs dry. Someone pawns the royal hunting dogs. And then comes the birthday massacre. Yes, it's as bad as it sounds. In 1141, Bela turns 33. Helena throws him a feast. The hall is decorated. Guests arrive cautiously. Last time, remember, the doors didn't open again. This time, she announces a celebration of renewed unity. She even invites some formerly disgraced nobles. There is food. There is wine. Then there is another list. It's not long, just 3 names. One noble faints before hearing his. Another tries to escape through the kitchen but trips on a ladle. Executions follow. Quiet, efficient, cold. Some say Bela had no idea what was coming. Others say he whispered the names to Helena himself, like a bedtime story with consequences. He dies shortly after, possibly from illness, possibly from heartbreak, or maybe just the slow crumbling of a man who was crowned, used and quietly forgotten. You walk past his tomb, simple as plain, tucked beneath the basilica of Sixvehervar, no grand statue, no fierce epitaph, just a worn carving of a crown, tilted slightly, as if unsure whether to stay. And thus ends the line of terrible kings, but not with a bang, with a blind whisper, and a birthday that no one celebrates anymore. And now the fire is low. You step away from courts and battlefields, from the glint of tarnished crowns and the weight of ruined thrones. The voices of mad kings, scheming queens, and unlucky nobles fade behind you, swallowed by the long corridors of history. Their footsteps echo a little longer, then vanish. Breathe. The air here is softer. The night is deeper. There are no more proclamations, no more lists, no more throne rooms held together with spite and gold thread. Only silence. Maybe your feet are sore from marching across centuries. Maybe your head still spins from curses. Disguises and tax policies made up on the spot. That's okay. You've earned your rest. Let the past crumble. The mistakes, the absurdities, the muffled regrets of rulers too blinded by power or just by hot irons have no more hold here. The bells Charles the Bald whispered to have stopped ringing. The last torch at Neuschwanstein has burned out. Even the Templars, wrongly accused by a very beautiful Philip, have stopped spinning in their graves. You are no longer wandering through time. You're floating now. Light, safe. Whatever crown you carry, whether made of gold, guilt, or insomnia, set it down beside you. There's no need to rule anything tonight. And if the ghosts of kings come knocking, tell them not tonight. Not this century. Just sleep. The stars outside your window care nothing for politics. They shine anyway. Quiet. Constant. Close your eyes. You've made it to the end.